Hello, my name is Frank Hodgson. I'm a lifelong resident of Scarborough, my family having moved from the Lagonia section of South Portland to the Willowdale Road in 1936 when I was 5 years old. I attended Scarborough schools, graduating from Scarborough High School with the class of 1950. I entered the U.S. Navy in November of that year with the onset of the Korean War and served my entire 4-year hitch aboard the wooden 136-foot auxiliary motor minesweeper USS Reedbird, AMS-51, which operated up and down the Atlantic coast from Key West, Florida to Newport, Rhode Island. Our home port was Charleston, South Carolina. I came home in September of 1954 at the cessation of Korean hostilities, having attained the enlisted grade of yeoman, second class. After a 6-month stint as a stock clerk at the Burbank and Douglas Company, purveyors of wholesale china and glass in Portland, I passed the civil service exam for the position of substitute clerk at the Scarborough Post Office, where I started work on July 6, 1955. My employment continued there for the next 31 years. I progressed from career substitute to regular clerk, then to assistant postmaster, then to assistant to the postmaster, and ultimately as superintendent of postal operations, retiring in June 1986, having attained the correct combination of age, which was 55, and service, 31 years. In the course of that time, I purchased the former home of Doris Homer at 11 Piper Road in January of 1965, where I continued to live until Piper Shores finalized their option to purchase my 2 acres along with Doris Homer's 136 acres in December of 1999. I have innumerable happy memories of my 34 years on the site of Piper Shores, and am happy to know that now hundreds of others will get to enjoy the beautiful sights, sounds, and living history of this spectacular location on the rock-bound coast of Maine. What is to follow is a capsule history of the area now occupied by Piper Shores, and a glimpse here and there of photographs I've taken of both the site and the wildlife who live here. I'm sure you won't be here long before you'll find the deer nibbling in the flower beds, as for years they did from my window boxes and along the stone wall in front of my house. I hope you'll forgive these little nostalgia trips, but I'm sure also that once you've lived here for but a short time, you too will be adding photographs to your memory book. I hope you enjoy the presentation that is to follow. The name Piper first became associated with the property in the early 1920s, when Portland banker Edward L. Piper of Vaughan Street, together with his wife Gertrude Bradford Jordan Piper, built the farm that is now at 18 Piper Road. At the same time, they built a summer cottage just over the fence at the end of Cliff Street, Higgins Beach, on land already in the Jordan family. Mrs. Piper's sister, Marion Jordan, lived in an imposing mansion on the shore a short distance to the south. The Pipers gradually expanded their cottage eventually winterizing it, and they lived in it year-round. The piper's son, Donald, married Doris Fairfield Flaws in the early 1930s, and the newlyweds built Hiddendale Poultry Farm on an adjacent 16-acre parcel of land. This is a late view of the house built by Donald and Doris to accompany the Hiddendale Poultry Farm, as it looked not long before I vacated it in October of 1999. Piper Road was constructed to connect the Piper properties to the Spruink Road in the year 1932, making it unnecessary to continue the old access via Higgins Beach and Cliff Street. This is another view of the Edward Piper residence as it was expanded by the Osgoods, and is shown here shortly before it was purchased in 1992 by Donald Crispin, who demolished it to make way for his new home. The house stood more or less on the site of Mr. Crispin's present-day four-car garage. Shown in this view was the road between the Piper residence near Higgins Beach along the highland to the home of Marion Jordan on the adjacent parcel to the south. After the death of Marion Jordan, the property was purchased by Prouts Neck resident Raymond Lapham, who had the mansion razed because he was more interested in holding on to the valuable land. His lot was later purchased by Mr. and Mrs. John Carver, who built their home somewhat to the south of the original location of the original Jordan residence. This is the view from almost where the Marion Jordan mansion stood, looking inland at the caretaker cottage and the barn that originally was associated with their property. It was later the home of the Reverend Franklin Cole, who in the 1960s had the last of the foundations of the Marion Jordan house bulldozed to improve his view of the ocean. This is the view in the opposite direction, looking from the site of the Marion Jordan house to Richmond Island, with Ram Island halfway between us and Richmond. In colonial times, Richmond Island was the residence of more than 200 families who felt safer living slightly offshore. They deemed the ocean a protection against the marauding tribes of Indians. Actually, there was hardly any protection associated with that residence because with their canoes, the Indians could reach the island in short order. The Jordans, who contributed so much to the area, lie buried at Mount Pleasant Cemetery on Meeting House Hill in South Portland. James Coffin Jordan was a founder and owner of the Diamond Match Lumber Company. His children were prominent, each in their own right. As we can see here, Samuel Spring Jordan died in 1921. Marion Curtis Jordan died in 1940, and Robert Rushworth Jordan, who led a life of eccentricity. By way of qualifying that statement, I will mention that in 1907, when he fell heir to the West Point House in Prouts Neck, after he ceased its operations as a hotel, he continued to live there from approximately 1915 to the 1960s, during which time he was the subject of much newsworthy comment in the local press. He was constantly accused of mistreating his animals, not feeding his cows. But in any event, he constructed the brick building adjacent to the hotel, which is now the residence of Doris Homer, formerly Doris Piper, as an adjunct of the Sebago Lumber Company, which he operated. Robert Jordan also maintained storage for hardwood flooring on his property on Danforth Street in Portland. The building eventually collapsed, and he was forced, after a term in the Cumberland County Jail, to complete the cleanup of the site. The Piper Shores logo of a four-masted schooner under full sail is strongly reminiscent of the vessels passing by out to sea off your turf 150 years ago, several of which came to grief within sight of this very building. One of them, the Howard W. Middleton, a three-master, grounded on a ledge at the mouth of the Spurwink River at the far end of Higgins Beach on August 11th, 1897. This is a view down Higgins Beach from near the foot of the cliff at Cliff Street, looking toward the Cape Elizabeth shore, or as Cape Elizabeth was once known, Spurwink. We're looking at the mouth of the Spurwink River at the spot where the Middleton came to grief. The crew, having no idea where they were, swam to the Cape Elizabeth shore when they could have walked ashore on Higgins Beach dead ahead. The ledge stove a hole in her hull, and she filled with seawater. When the tide went out, the water's weight combined with her cargo of coal, and the vessel settled athwart the ledge, breaking her spine. A subsequent storm drove the vessel further up the beach, where her bones still bleach as they are periodically exposed by the shifting sand. Here we have a view taken on Higgins Beach as it looked during the early part of the 20th century. Here's another view looking from Higgins Beach over across the Spurwink River to the Cape Elizabeth shore. This is the site of Bowden's Ferry, which was an important river crossing in colonial days when the only highway between Portland, or Casco as it was then known, and Portsmouth was along the shore, usually following the beaches and the cliff. Another schooner, the two-masted Fanny and Edith, crashed ashore in the cove just south of here in front of the Marion Jordan mansion on December 4th, 1900, having dragged anchor all the way from just inside Richmond Island during a rising gale. The vessel had put out 2 anchors, but one chain parted, and the remaining one was insufficient to hold her. Just as the crew thought all was lost, one gigantic wave lifted the vessel over the ledges and left it in a cradling crevice high up the cliff. The crew put out a plank and walked ashore. This wreck was immortalized by Prouts Neck artist Winslow Homer in his 1908 watercolor, The Wrecked Schooner, currently owned by the St. Louis Art Museum. Probably the most spectacular shipwreck along this stretch of coast occurred on June 11, 1903, when the five-masted schooner Washington B. Thomas, laden with 4,226 tons of soft coal, piled up on the cruel rocks of Stratton Island just off Prouts Neck amid a rising gale in the dark of night. The Thomas, the largest sailing vessel ever built in Thomaston, Maine, had only been completed 2 months earlier and was on her maiden voyage. Here's another early view of Higgins Beach, the way it looked right after the Higgins family relented and began allowing the sale of lots on what had once been their family farm. This, as may be guessed from the costumes on the people in the photograph, is from the early part of the 20th century. Returning to Bowden's Ferry and the King's Highway, I will repeat that the King's Highway once was the main means of passing from Portland to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Mr. Bowden operated an ordinary in connection with his ferry across the Spurwink River, or what today we would call a tavern. Mr. Bowden's holdings were later acquired intact by Hiram Higgins, whose descendants owned all the area now comprising Higgins Beach. The Higgins family continued to farm the area into the early 1900s, leasing lots for modest camps or tents, but not selling an inch. Early arrivals to the area had to accept the marauding cows as part of the summer experience. Streets originally ran parallel to the shore. Then Edward Higgins began to sell lots, built the Higgins Inn in 1923 after the demise of his father, and development continues to this day. Seen here is the original hotel at Prouts Neck. The designers of Piper Shores, of course, said at one of the planning board meetings that the design of the Piper Shores complex was to echo the large shingle-style hotels which once dotted the Prouts Neck and Scarborough Beach area. Shown here is the original hotel at Prouts Neck, the Prouts Neck House, which was the original residence of Thomas Libby III. Upon Thomas' death in 1873, his children decided to liquidate their inheritance and began to sell lots. At this time, the other hotels sprang up in the Prouts Neck area. As more and more people decided to come to the Prouts Neck area because of the excellent hunting in its woods and fishing just off its beaches, Mr. Libby found it expedient to take in boarders who fished and fowled. He gradually added to his complex until it looked like this. The building continues to exist today, although in the early part of the 20th century it was cut in two. The left portion was moved back from the road and continues to exist as the Perry House. The other portion was moved a short distance down the road, turned at right angles to the street, and continues to serve as the Prouts Neck Post Office and store. Mr. V.T. Shaw, who made the move, added several stories to the structure in later years, so it no longer looks exactly like this, but as I say, it continues to this day. Thomas Libby's son Silas built the Kamek House to the ocean side of the former location of the Prouts Neck House. Benaiah Libby, on the other hand, built his hotel on the Shorewood side of his father's property, and it became known as the Willows. It is seen here in its latest configuration shortly before it was raised in the 1960s. Surely the most spectacular and most photographed of the grand hotels at Prouts Neck is the Checkley House, begun in the 1870s by entrepreneur Ira C. Foss. This is one of the earlier views of the Checkley House, shortly after it was begun by Ira Foss. This is a view from the lesser seen side, which faced the ocean, from one of the hotel's brochures, probably published in the 1930s, showing it nearly at its full growth. Another view of the Checkley as it continued to grow, as seen from the public road, which now, of course, is paved and leads up to the gate at the end of the public way. Ira Foss continued to expand and improve on the hotel until his death in 1919, after which the business carried on by his widow, Mary Larrabee Foss, until it was forced to close because of the blackouts and wartime conditions along the coast in 1941. Seen here is a favorite postcard view of the hotel complex. Seen here is Checkley Point when it was bereft of its great hotel, but when one of the two residences which now occupy the site had been completed, but before the commencement of the second structure. This is my favorite view of the Checkley complex, showing it at full development, and from this photograph you get an idea how completely it filled its site. The trees, which were mere saplings in some of the earlier photographs, can be seen now at their full height on the landward side. The hotel was torn down in the 1940s. Many bits and pieces of it are incorporated in cottages all over Prouts Neck. A door here, a fireplace mantel there, you name it. Everyone was only too anxious to buy a piece of history when its millwork was sold off bit by bit as it was dismantled. This, of course, was the subject of this year's Lions Club Christmas ornament. Here's an early view of the Southgate House, a hotel built by the son of Otis Kaler, who operated the Kirkwood Hotel at Scarborough Beach for many years. This was built by his son, John Kaler. Of course, the hotel has changed very much over the years and is the only one to still continue in business. We know it today as the Black Point Inn. This is a photograph of the Jocelyn Hotel, which was one of the more ornate of the hotels in the Prout's Neck area. It was built in 1890 by Frank B. Libby. Originally, it had a long, boxy appearance similar to the Southgate Hotel. In 1898, the noted architect John Calvin Stevens redesigned it, changing the roofline and adding the Victorian towers and trim. The Jocelyn was consumed in a dramatic fire that started in the pre-dawn hours of July 27, 1909. Fire broke out in the stable of Alonzo Guggins, who had his home and business established between the Jocelyn and the Southgate hotels. The fire raged out of control, burning Alonzo Guggins' buildings, and the wind swept the flames to the Jocelyn. Had it been blowing in the opposite direction, the Southgate might well have burned. Without an organized fire department, nothing could be done to stop the flames. This is an early view of what came to be called the Atlantic House, which was built in 1850. Its operation was taken over by Enoch Nutter, and eventually Elihu Gunnison became its owner and operated it for many, many years. Descendants of his family continued to be its managers. Here we have a much later view of the Atlantic House, when its roofline had changed and many of its configurations had changed. It continued in business for about 130 years. This is the way the Atlantic House looked in its later years. I took this photograph in 1986, which is close to the time when it was demolished to make way for the Atlantic House condominium. The hotel had really come to the end of its days without a sprinkler system and changing tastes. It had been visited for years by generations of people, largely from Toronto and Quebec. Here's a view of the Hotel Kirkwood, which was built on a parcel adjacent to the Atlantic House by Gunnison heir James and his wife Mary. It was operated for most of its useful life by Otis Kaler, as I mentioned earlier in my description of the Black Point Inn, which was built by Otis Kaler's son John. Perhaps the most noteworthy thing about the Kirkwood was the fact that its last formal operations ceased in the summer of 1906, and the complex continued to stand on the site until the 1920s, when it was ultimately torn down. Joe Knight bought the lot upon which it stands not too long after he came into ownership of the Atlantic House. Closely resembling the style of Piper Shores, although it's not a shingle-style building. Most of the hotels were clapboards in actual fact, except for the later appearance of the Black Point Inn, which is the shingle style. Here is a photograph I took in the 1970s of the cliff out in front of Piper Shores as it looked in the wintertime. This was one picture I used as my Christmas card for that year. Here's a photograph of yours truly as I looked in the spring of 1958 when I was a Brother of the Brush in observance of Scarborough's 300th anniversary celebration. Shown here is then Postmaster Fred E. Skillings, running through the canceling machine first day covers of the first sailing vessel built in Maine, which was issued in observance of our 300th anniversary celebration. It was at this time that the spelling of the town's name was changed from Scarboro to the more formal Scarborough. The battle had raged for years about which was the proper spelling. I think I was partially instrumental in making the ultimate determination to use the long spelling echoing our town in Scarborough, England. Scarborough, Ontario and Scarborough, Australia use the long spelling, and I thought it would be appropriate if we did too. This is a scene out my picture window when I lived here. As you can see from the woods in the background, it's before the land was cleared between me and the ocean in 1992, affording me an unrestricted view of the water. The deer used to come up and nibble the petunias right out of my window box, but I love them nonetheless. The nemesis of my bird feeder, one of the squirrels who used to daily come and raid my bird feeder. No matter what I did, they outdid me every time. Instead of preventing them from climbing the pole, that ring provided a handy perch for them to consume my oiled sunflower seed. Seen here is one of the tour buses which brought guests to the formal groundbreaking ceremony, which took place in my front lawn on October 5th, 1999, when Piper Shores was beginning to near reality. The fall season was appropriate for mums to be the flower of choice. That and the Halloween, which consisted of pumpkins and gourds and corn shocks. As the big tent rose, mighty preparations for the important speeches which were to follow. Here, of course, is another photograph of Doris Homer, who on that big day, October 5th, 1999, was the person who turned the first spadeful of earth opening Piper Shores. I took a video of these proceedings, but of course, throughout the pre-preparation, the band was tuning up, and it's very annoying to listen to them tuning their instruments, so I thought that perhaps the still pictures were better than the movie. Shown here is the carpenter who was erecting the podium from which Merton Henry would introduce the important visiting firemen. Here's a winter scene from the days when I had to worry about plowing my own driveway from my residence at 11 Piper Shores all the way up to the Spurwink Road, something which you people are never going to have to worry about. For me, it was a real concern. Also, flooding was a real concern. This is a photograph which was taken during the storm of the century on October 21st, 1986, when we had 23 inches of rain. This is the little pond which used to be out in front of my garage and which is now the actually the end of your Kirkwood wing and the driveway. I appropriately named this Frank's Winter Wonderland, and this too was on one of my many Christmas cards. I enjoyed 34 seasons here, all of which I committed to film. This is a view from where my driveway joined Piper Road, looking toward Spurwink. Of course, the gully at the far end is no longer there. It was filled up with stone crushed from the blasting site under the Piper Shores building. I think perhaps that's the best improvement that's happened in the years since I left. This is the gully, looking from Spurwink Road down to the brook, and as you can well imagine, many a winter morning I looked up in this direction from down by the brook and wondered how in heaven's name I was going to get my tractor up that slope. Here's another view taken from the same vantage point after the gully had been nearly completely filled in. Another view from my breezeway toward the ocean, this time in the autumn, when the leaves had pretty much fallen and my view of the water was pretty much unrestricted. As construction progressed, I really looked with disbelief from my back step at what had been a tree-lined driveway. Now, of course, the right-of-way has been expanded. The road has risen by several feet, and storms are no longer a problem. In this photo, further construction is underway and blasting is taking place to pour the foundations for the Kirkwood wing. Piled up here are trees which used to surround my house, and we're looking toward Richmond Island, more or less from where my breezeway once stood, past the house lately built by Mr. Sims on property he acquired from the Alexander Pratt residence. Excavation continues. Construction trailer has arrived on the site, and steel work is about to go up. Here a photograph of my former garage, built in 1941 by William Googins of Routs Neck, under contract to Doris and Donald Piper. Here the asbestos siding is being removed, preparatory to its being burned down as a training exercise for the Scarborough Fire Department. Here a final view of my old residence shortly before it was placed on steel skids and began its circuitous journey to a new location at Higgins Beach. Another view of the house from the berm, which was built to protect the Pratt residence from the spilling over light from Piper Shores, looking down the old road at where the retention pond is under construction to the right. Here we see the foundations being laid for the Kirkwood wing, with excavation still in progress from the location where the great room probably now stands. A last loving look at my old residence looking up from what used to be the curve in the driveway just below the house. The floor of the Kirkwood wing has just been poured, and construction of the walls and superstructure will begin within the week. My old house, where it rested partway down the road for the months until the Kopp moving firm of Cumberland came and moved it the rest of the way to its new location at Higgins Beach. And later still, the Kirkwood wing is rising in this view, and the superstructure for the public rooms is going up in the middle. This concludes my talk. Thank you, and I hope you find this interesting. If you'd like to know more about Scarborough history, may I suggest that you read this book, which is one of many by Peter Dow Batchelder, who is a resident originally coming from the North Scarborough or South Gorham area of Scarborough. This book, which contains a very entertaining story about Stratton's Island, the farm home of Portland magnate James Coffin Jordan for many years, who operated the farm on the scene where the Washington B. Thomas came to grief. This book, which contains many stirring Indian tales of old Scarborough, which was written at the time of Scarborough's 300th anniversary celebration in 1958. This book, which is available as a reprint from the Scarborough Historical Society, and this book, which also is available as a reprint from the Scarborough Historical Society. I might also encourage you to visit the Scarborough Historical Society Museum. The Historical Society Museum is open on Tuesday mornings from 9 o'clock to noontime. It's located at 649A US Route 1, which is adjacent to the Engine 6 firehouse in the Dunston area. We invite your membership. Our rates are very reasonable, and in exchange for your annual dues, you receive a copy of our quarterly newsletter, which is known as the Owaskawag Notes. Thank you for your attention.